Hello and welcome to our next webinar in the Sage Politics webinar series 2025. Today's webinar is called Beyond Westminster, an innovative new approach to teaching UK politics, presented by Alan Convery, editor and co-author of UK Politics, published this year by Sage. My name is Fawzia Eastwood and I'm a marketing manager at Sage for the Politics and International Relations books portfolio. I'm a cisgender woman of South Asian background. I have long, dark brown hair, brown eyes, on olive skin, and I'm wearing a navy blue dress with white embroidery. My pronouns are she, her. Before we start, I'd like to share some webinar housekeeping information. My colleague Amy Douglas is technical host of today's webinar and will also be facilitating the question and answer section. We are recording this webinar. However, we have switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presenter and the host. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without background noise. The chat box won't be available for participants during this webinar. If you have any questions, though, please write them in the question and answer box, and we'll reply to as many of those as we can during the session. Please take advantage of our presenters' expertise and focus any questions you may have around the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll upload the recorded video to Sage's YouTube channel in the next few days. We'll also share it with you via an email and on our social media channels. Sage is on X and also on Blue Sky, so do follow us there if you aren't already. We're at sagepub.com. We've made closed captions available during this webinar, so do switch those on if they're helpful for you. As mentioned, today's webinar is hosted by Sage. Sage is a global academic publisher of books, journals, and library resources with a growing range of technologies to enable discovery, access, and engagement. Our mission is building bridges to knowledge, supporting the development of ideas through the research process, scholarship that is certified, taught, and applied across all fields of social science. Whether you're preparing to teach a course, conducting research, or looking to publish your next research paper, our Sage Politics and International Relations portfolios provide top quality, easy to access materials to help you make the most use of your time and excel in your field. We're delighted to introduce today's webinar, which will be presented by Alan Convery, editor and co-author of UK Politics, which published earlier this year. It will be referenced during this webinar. You can find out more about the book on the next slide. And you can also find out more about it on our website, www.sagepub.co.uk, or if you scan the QR code on the slide, you can go directly to the webpage that way. And attendees of today's webinar can get 25% discount using the code that you see on screen, SAGE, AUTH25, or if you're a lecturer, you can also request yourself an electronic inspection copy. I'm delighted to introduce our presenter today. Alan Convery is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Edinburgh. His research focuses on UK and Scottish politics and conservatism and the Conservative Party. He is the author of The Territorial Conservative Party, Devolution and Party Change in Scotland and Wales, published in 2016. He was deputy editor and lead editor of the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. At Edinburgh, he organises the Introduction to British Politics course and received the Chancellor's Award for Teaching in 2019. Alan, we're so delighted to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Fawzia, and thanks for everyone for attending this webinar on what's a particularly sunny day. I'm delighted to join you to be able to talk about the new textbook that we have just published. And to talk a bit about the approach that we've taken in the book to teaching and learning in British politics. So I'll talk a bit about the approach that we take, this idea of a post-Westminster polity, something about the structure and pitch of the textbook, and how we try to cover the basics and also branch into new sort of areas as well. So next slide, please. So I suppose that one of the first questions we have to confront is why another textbook about UK politics? So the screen is blurred behind me, but if it wasn't blurred, you'd see that my bookcase behind me contains a fair few copies of books about UK politics. So the question is, why do we need another textbook about UK politics, and what is different about our textbook? So I think what we've tried to do in this book, which is an edited volume, which has authors who are colleagues of mine at Edinburgh and beyond, I think what we've all tried to do is present an account that's more territorial, critical and expansive, so that takes territorial politics seriously, that tries to provide a critical account and tries to sort of expand a bit what we see as UK politics. So we sort of frame it by starting off with the idea of the UK, or a question really about, is the UK still the sort of Westminster polity that we might recognise or might have been recognisable to someone writing a textbook in the 1950s? What sort of aspects of that previous way of looking at the UK politics still survive? And we use that to start off a series of debates about questions about how UK politics works today. And we've tried to bring together a set of leading authors who are active and research in this area to write in an accessible way for undergraduate students. Next slide, please. So one of the dilemmas with teaching UK politics to an introductory level to undergraduates is the question of how much theory we should introduce. So sometimes as academics we're keen to introduce the idea of theories of UK politics. What's it like? How have academics debated this? How has it been theorised? But then we're also pulled in the other direction by the fact that many of us only have a 10-week course or a 12-week course, and we also want to cover the basics, and we also want to do it in a way that's engaging to students and doesn't put them off and stays at an accessible and introductory level. So there's this dilemma of how much theory we should introduce. So we try to get over this, or try to provide a way in theoretically to UK politics by asking this question about, is the UK a post-Westminster polity? So the introductory chapter, which I've written, tries to draw the book together in the various chapters and tries to pose a series of provocative questions about what is UK politics like today. So it begins with this idea of the Westminster model, so the old way that we would look at UK politics, very much focused on old institutions, an elitist settlement that's based on taking decisions at the centre, with Parliament and Whitehall very much the focus. And it talks about that, but it uses it more as a sort of yardstick or a starting off point to say, well, is the UK still like this? To what extent would it be accurate to describe the UK as a post-Westminster polity? And it places new approaches alongside that traditional understanding to try to get students to ask the question, well, how much has changed? Does the UK find itself somewhere in between that old Westminster polity, that Westminster model? And we can still recognise some features of that. It isn't quite, though, a new sort of polity entirely. So does it find itself somewhere in the middle? And it's to get students to think about whereabouts does perhaps the UK find itself in the middle that's the sort of driving shaper of what we're trying to do in this textbook. Next slide, please. So the overall pitch for the textbook is that it's aimed at undergraduate introductory courses, and it's sort of developed out of the undergraduate introductory course that we teach here at Edinburgh. So it very much wants to succeed as a textbook that provides an excellent undergraduate introduction. But it also, I think, wants to try to act as a sort of bridge to get students to think about up-to-date research and to pose some of those wider big questions that I talked about. And there are various features that I'll talk about in a moment that try to sort of bridge that gap between an introduction and then some of the more up-to-date research on UK politics. I think it was also important to us that it could be used in a variety of different ways. So I think this textbook would very much work as a plan for a full UK politics course. But we're also aware that there are different flavours to UK politics courses, different timings, different constraints. And so each chapter, although they refer to each other, can stand alone very well individually. So it also lends itself to a pick and mix approach where you might use some chapters and not others. And so what we try to do is cover the basics really well and engagingly. So for our UK politics course that really wants to focus on nailing the institutional foundations of the UK, I think this textbook would work well with separate chapters on constitution, on Parliament. but it also tries to branch out a little bit into some more less trodden areas, and like the media or empire, for example. Next slide, please. One of the things we were also keen to do is provide students a way of talking about controversial or difficult issues in UK politics. And one of the questions that we posed then was, well, a lot of the fiery debates about UK politics are about identity. So questions of identity, how have these issues raised themselves in UK politics? And how can we help students talk about these questions in a more social scientific way with evidence? How can we provide a way in to some of these big debates? So Sarah Child's chapter in this volume tries to provide a way in to talk about representation and tries to get away from ideas of zero-sum ideas about representation, and instead, drawing on her work on feminist democratic representation, start to talk about representation as more of a bricolage of different concepts and different things, and that there are different goods we can prioritize in representation. And so representation as a sort of multifaceted thing, and when we talk about it, we're often talking past each other because we're talking about different things. So Sarah's chapter tries to deconstruct and have a look at what do we mean by representation and give students the tools to talk about it. And she talks explicitly about that article by Mansbridge about the idea that should blacks represent blacks and women represent women. And she talks and breaks down these sort of debates and these sort of things that sometimes cause a lot of heat in UK politics. She tries to break down what we're talking about there. We then break down and examine some key areas for representation and key areas of identity in the UK. So Kenny examines the idea of gender and politics in the UK. I'm really pleased that we have a chapter by Peace and Meir on race and ethnicity in the UK. So I always found that when I was teaching race and ethnicity in UK politics, that I was always looking for a really good introductory chapter, but I couldn't quite find one that suited my purposes and that gave students that was an easier introduction to this and sort of outlined some of the state of the debate and some of the latest research. I think that a really good and attractive feature of this textbook is the race and ethnicity chapter that provides a really good introduction for students to this area. And then Greenwood Howe's chapter talks about class as well, which is increasingly an issue in UK politics, and it's referred to throughout this idea of what do we do with the graduate political class, this idea of a political class that's out of touch. He talks about some of these ideas and some of these ideas about class in British politics. So all of those chapters are separate for pedagogical reasons, just to sort of draw out the separate ideas to analyse them individually. But each of those chapters emphasises the interconnectedness of these issues and the ways in which these different facets of identity can intersect. Next slide, please. As I say, one of the things we were keen to do is to make sure that this wasn't a textbook that was too niche or didn't suit the needs of lecturers when they were convening an introductory course on UK politics. So we were very keen that this is a textbook that covers the basics well, but an engaging way. So the chapters on the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, in addition to talking about those parties, also provide much of the background to UK politics after 2024. There's also a chapter on the Constitution, which you might expect, so covering the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. But what I and Asanga Valikala try to do in that chapter is to take a critical view of parliamentary sovereignty. So looking at parliamentary sovereignty so students can understand it, but also looking at what are the latest challenges to parliamentary sovereignty and the question of why perhaps students might find that parliamentary sovereignty is talked about in a different way by MPs than it's talked about by academics. Similarly, and it would be standard issue, I think, to have some sort of lecture or week or tutorial on Parliament. I think what Mark Geddes tries to do in his chapter is to get beyond the idea of parliamentary decline and start to talk about, or start to encourage students to talk about and engage with debates about the changing nature of the legislature, the latest work on how analysis of amendments might show a different picture to the idea that the executive always dominates, talking about issues like MPs' mental health and other things. So a chapter that nails the idea of the parliamentary process, but also tries to move students onto a bit of new territory in terms of the latest work on Parliament. And then finally, and similarly, the chapter on the executive by Richard Parry covers the idea of Prime Minister and Cabinet, but also tries to expand on ideas about Rhodes's idea, for example, of ministers operating in departmental courts, about the centre feeling that it has lost control, and he homes in some case studies of where the politicians and the civil service have clashed. What does that tell us about the relationship between the politicians and the civil service, what they think of it, but also what does that tell us about the nature and the difficulty of governing the UK in the 21st century? Next slide, please. I think another big feature of this book is the focus on territory. So we really wanted to emphasise the idea of the UK as a multi-level polity. So in Henderson's chapter, she has great expertise on this, having run the Scottish election study for many years and having published extensively on electoral behaviour. She gives a multi-level account of voting behaviour in the UK, so talking about this idea that when we refer to the British voter or to British voting behaviour, sometimes we're referring to a fictitious place, a place that doesn't exist. Instead, we have to disaggregate how people in different parts of the UK vote differently, but sometimes vote the same, or vote differently, but have underlying political attitudes that are the same. And students, of course, might recognise her from some of the election coverage last year. I'm also quite happy that we're one of the first UK politics textbooks to dedicate a separate chapter to each of the constituent nations of the UK. So we talk about the development of Scotland, the development of Wales, and the Welsh chapter has a really good timeline of the evolution of devolution in Wales and provides a really good way in and reference point for students and colleagues alike, I think. I'm also pleased that we have a separate chapter on England as a separate political unit. And this might be a discussion point for students to say, well, why would textbooks in the 1950s or 60s have not bothered to look at England potentially as a separate political unit? So what has changed about UK politics that makes it seem appropriate in 2024 to say, no, we need a separate chapter on England that doesn't elide Britishness and Englishness? And what are some of the consequences for our study of UK politics if we stop eliding Britishness and Englishness? So I think I'm pleased that chapter's there. I think it's a really good introduction that covers everything from Gareth Southgate to the end of empire and Brexit, and talks about Englishness in a really engaging way. I'm also really pleased that we have a separate chapter on Northern Ireland. So I've often been in the position of not putting Northern Ireland on the reading list or on the list for a module, particularly an introductory module on UK politics, because we often put Northern Ireland in the too hard basket. We think, and I've been here, that you can't appropriately cover it in 50 minutes in your lecture. But I think the chapter that Lisa Claire Whitten has written is a really accessible introduction to the history and politics of Northern Ireland, basically asking how did we get here, providing a really accessible way into talking about this issue. And so I hope that can be used as a resource to add in a week or any sort of discussion of Northern Ireland. I think it's a really useful chapter for students to use to talk about that. Next slide, please. Beyond the basic fundamentals I think you would expect with any UK politics textbook, we've also tried to branch out a little bit to add things that might be of interest to students. So Brexit and beyond, in that chapter, Ben Martel, a colleague of mine here, talks about the idea of the initial heat of Brexit has died down. So what's left over and what's Britain's place in the world, and what are the sort of issues that mean that the consequence of Brexit will keep on coming up in UK politics? And I think his chapter provides a really good introduction to that and to some debates about the UK's place in the world. Similarly, the foreign policy chapter by Victoria Honeyman talks about the idea of how UK foreign policy is made and the sort of challenges that the UK is facing as a middling power in the 21st century, and uses case studies to demonstrate the UK's dilemmas in that sense. One thing that students are also really keen to talk about, I always find, is media and social media, but sometimes they lack the tools or the data or the research to talk about that in a social scientific way. So the chapter by Llewellyn and Vicari takes this sort of hot topic, or a topic that everyone is interested in, or a topic that everyone has an intuition matters but aren't quite sure exactly how it matters. They take us right through the ideas of old media and new media and social media, and talk about the sort of research that sheds light on the way that social media is changing the way politicians talk and the way we campaign in UK politics. But also, I think, in a way that says that this is important but doesn't overshadow everything. And finally, Harshan Kumarasingham talks about the idea of UK politics and the end of empire. So in what ways is the UK a post-imperial state? And in what ways can we see legacies of empire in either the institutions of British politics or the way in which debates are framed in UK politics? Next slide, please. Each chapter has a set of common features that try to help students navigate the discussion that comes afterwards. So there's a what will this chapter tell me, an initial summary, a what do I need to know box that says, well, this chapter is assuming some knowledge and just brushing up on some essential knowledge that students need to know in order to fully make sense of that chapter. Research and focus boxes try to present a piece of recent academic research and show how it's relevant to the themes in the chapter. So trying to provide that bridge between the introduction in the chapter and what are social scientists in the UK researching about this right now. And there's a whole host of different studies that are highlighted in that. We also use case studies to highlight little things that might be of interest and illuminating. So in the executive chapter, Richard Parry talks about the debates around Dominic Raab's behaviour as a minister, for example. What was that about, and what does it tell us about the modern relationship between the executive and the civil service? They end with a chapter summary, just highlighting the key points, and then for students to take it further, some further reading suggestions. Next slide, please. So what we've tried to present, and of course students and colleagues will tell us if we've succeeded or not, what we've tried to do is provide a different but engaging textbook. So it's framed around the idea of to what extent is the UK a post-Westminster polity? How far has the UK moved beyond its old ways of working, and has it moved further in some areas than others? And if it's not quite a Westminster polity and it's not quite a post-Westminster polity in its entirety, where does the UK find itself? We tried to bring together a diverse group of leading authors who are researching at the cutting edge of these topics, but also writing in an accessible way for students and having a common chapter structure that allows students to get a way into reading each chapter. We've also tried to provide a bridge to the academic research through selective references. So it's not a reference-heavy textbook, but it does try to direct students towards what are the most important works, and use boxed highlights and recommended reading to try to highlight where students could go next. I think it could be used as a structure to a whole course. I think it follows much of the structure we use at Edinburgh, and I think it could be a coherent structure. But pick and mixing the chapters, I think, would be very appropriate as well. So they refer to each other, but they certainly could be used as standalone chapters or standalone readings for students on different courses. And I think what we've tried to do is be innovative, but not so innovative that this is too much of a niche textbook. So this is very much a mainstream UK politics textbook. It's not too theoretical that it cannot be used widely, and we have tried to sort of balance the idea of innovation and a useful textbook to provide something that's a little bit different insofar as it's multi-level, but also provides an engaging and useful introduction to UK politics for undergraduate students. So that's all I have to say in my presentation, and I'm now very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Alan. And that was a very, very insightful introduction to the materials in UK politics. And as you mentioned, yes, we are open for questions. So please do write them in the question and answer box. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Amy, who will be facilitating this section. And yes, please do. Thank you.
Thanks, Fawzia, and thank you, Alan, for that super insightful presentation. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy, and I'm the marketing executive for our politics list here at Sage. I'm a white cisgender woman. I've got dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. My pronouns are she/her. So yes, I'll be taking us through the Q&A portion of this webinar. So if you've got any, just pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And while we wait for a few questions to come through, we've got some that were submitted in advance. So the first question for Alan is, what work experience would be helpful for an A-level student before pursuing a career in politics?
Thanks very much, Amy. Yeah, so this is a great question. I think there are lots of different ways you can do politics. So one of the most useful websites I find for students who are interested in jobs that are politics adjacent is a website called W4MP, which not only contains a series of job adverts from MPs and public policy and public relations organisations, but also has a section on the website with tips about how to get involved in politics, how to apply for these jobs, and what these sort of jobs involve. And it also has tips from previous people who, for example, have worked as researchers for MPs or who have worked in Parliament or lobbying or other things. So I'd say there's a whole range of ways that you can get involved, and that would be a good place to start the journey.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, should Scotland gain its independence, and how would trade and overall economics change politically and socially for the UK?
Great, so a short, easy question. So I think one of the things about Scottish independence, the proposition of Scottish independence after Brexit, is that the Scottish National Party relied to some extent on its case for independence in 2014 on Scotland and the rest of the UK, both continuing to be European Union members. So if Scotland and an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK are EU members, that solves some problems in terms of trade, because trade could continue on the same basis that both would be EU members. So following EU regulations, there would be free-flowing goods between those two countries, because both would be in the single market and the customs union of the European Union. Now that an independent Scotland would potentially be trading with an England, or would in the current context be trading with an England that's outside the EU, this somewhat complicates the case for Scottish independence, or at the very least it necessitates a slight change from the case that the Scottish National Party put forward in 2014. So some of the issues that are faced by Northern Ireland, for example, at the moment, and Northern Ireland's trade with the Republic and the rest of the UK. So, for example, would you need to have some sort of checks on the border between Scotland and England that might be insisted upon if, for example, an independent Scotland was a member of the EU and the rest of the UK wasn't? So these challenges are not necessarily insurmountable ones, but I think they require a reformulation of some of the case for independence that the SNP put forward, and I think that's what the Scottish National Party are working on at the moment. So if you are pro-Scottish independence, you might say, well, these are not insurmountable problems, and that Scotland will benefit massively from being back in the EU. An independent Scotland that was a member of the EU would benefit massively from being able to trade freely in the single European market with lots of other European countries. If you are anti-independence, you might say, well, that may be the case, but Scotland trades more with England than it does with the rest of the EU, so there might be some transitional problems there. So I think it necessitates a change in the case for independence, and it's another sort of terrain where both pro and anti-independence supporters will argue about the economic benefits or disadvantages of independence.
Thank you. That's a super in-depth answer, so thank you. Our last question is, has the interest and approach to teaching UK politics changed after Brexit?
That's a good question as well. Yes, I think we've noticed an uptick in students that take our Introduction to British Politics course at Edinburgh, and there seems to be overall healthy interest in courses on politics in the UK, which is obviously very encouraging. I think that Brexit has highlighted a number of issues that we maybe had in the background before that we didn't talk about explicitly. So maybe we didn't talk explicitly about the idea of, for example, non-tariff barriers to trade. So the idea that the single market of the EU means that people accept product standards that are harmonised across the EU, and that makes trade quite easy to facilitate because it doesn't require lots of checks. So sometimes we think of trade in terms of tariffs. And this is what we're talking about right now, of course, in the world, that tariffs create barriers to trade. But something maybe we didn't quite appreciate as much, and we're talking about more, is the idea of non-tariff barriers to trade as well. I think it's also highlighted ideas of, again, the UK's place in the world. So it's re-energised and re-politicised debates about what the UK should do, or what should be the UK's foreign policy role. And I think we try to cover some of this in the textbook, that UK governments had decided that it would be a good idea to try and project UK power through the European Union, that would be the best way of promoting the UK's interests. So post-Brexit requires a sort of reformulation of that sort of policy preference that had been the policy preference among UK elites for a long time. And so there's that perennial question of what is the UK's role. I think finally also it drew attention to this idea, and this was picked up in the media, of the left behind voter, of this idea, and this leads into other sort of places or things like the ideas of the red wall, of somewheres and nowheres, of the idea of the geographic divide, particularly in England. So I think it re-energised a debate about class and about perhaps a difference between British political elite perceptions of economic benefits or foreign policy benefits of EU membership with other people's perception of economic decline or a different interpretation of what is good or what are the good things about the UK or UK politics. So I think it re-energized a debate about a disconnect between UK elites and some parts of the population. And I think, and certainly in my own teaching, I tried to cover that. So linking it to questions of the rise of the UK Independence Party, the rise of the Brexit Party, Reform UK, and linking those questions to wider questions about change in liberal democracies, so the rise of populist radical right parties in all sorts of countries, and the sort of transformation of the right in those countries as well. So I think definitely Brexit has changed how we approach teaching UK politics and some of the issues that we talk about.
Thank you. That was the last of our pre-prepared questions. So if anybody has any final questions, just pop them in the Q&A chat, and if we don't get to them today, we can answer after the webinar. But yeah, I will hand things back over to Forgia.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you very much, Alan, for answering to those questions. And we still have a few more minutes if people are wanting to write anything in the question box. There is still a little bit more time, but if that isn't something that we, so if there aren't any more questions, we can actually conclude our presentation here. So on the next slide, I'm just going to give you a quick reminder of our webpage where you can find out more about UK politics. If the presentation has whetted your appetite to find out more about this book, if you want to buy a copy of the book, there is a 25% discount if you use the code that you see on screen, SAGE, AUTH 25. But if you're a lecturer or a module leader, you can also request yourself an electronic inspection copy from our webpage too. As mentioned earlier, we'll be sending an email with the webinar recording link to you over the next few days, so you can watch it again, or please do share it with any colleagues who may be interested and weren't able to attend today. Yes, and once again, thank you so much to you, Alan, today for your time today, for the very engaging and insightful presentation. And thank you also to Amy for co-hosting this Q&A section and for all the technical support you've provided to facilitate the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and goodbye.